Okay, we're about to start the last section of Unit 3. So this is 3.9, Demographic Transition. This is a chart you're going to want to become very familiar with and understand everything that's on here. So we'll talk about this as we get going here, but let's just jump into this and talk about some different background information for this section. Okay, so industrialization, that's the first kind of term or period of time that you really need to make sure that you understand. So, industrialization is the process of both economic and social transition from a farming economy, often called an agrarian economy, to an industrial or manufacturer based economy. Okay, and so this in this country happened at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And so industrialized countries are, you know, they have a low death rate. Industrialized countries, I'm kind of jumped here to this last little bullet here, but industrialized or developed is another word that we use. Countries also have a low infant mortality rate. They tend to have a very high GDP, gross domestic product, from the last section, and a low total fertility rate. Okay, and so this industrialization starts off as a country that is pre-industrialized or less developed. So that's kind of like industrialized where we are in the US. We're kind of at the end of this industrialization process. And some countries are like pre-industrialization. They're still more agrarian type nations. Okay. So a country that has not yet met a country is considered pre-industrialized or less developed if they have not yet made that switch from agrarian to industrial. They're usually very poor with a low GDP. They typically have a higher death rate and a high IMR, infant mortality rate, and they have a high TFR for replacement children and to have agricultural labor. So the women tend to have a higher TFR so that there's enough people in their family to work in the fields to provide for the family. Okay. And then so the kind of second stage of this is the industrializing, I should say, or developing stage of this industrialization process. And this is when a country is partway through the transition. The death rate is decreasing, the IMR is decreasing, or yes, decreasing. Sorry, I had to think about it in my head for a second. And then there tends to be a rising GDP. Okay, so there's more funds available per person in the country. The country is becoming more wealthy, I guess, or more affluent. Usually more education is occurring as well. Okay, and so here's the development status or the industrialization status of countries around the world. And it's pretty much what you would expect. What we generally call the West or North America, not Mexico, and Europe, Western Europe. That's what we usually tend to call the westernized countries. Australia's lumped in there as well. That is because we have reached that kind of like post-industrialization, like we are completely industrialized or developed. And then we have countries in yellow that are considered to be developing countries. So they're kind of in the middle of this path to industrialization. And then we still have some countries in Africa that are considered least developed or less developed, Middle East, right? Some Asian countries. And this is all classifications based on the UN development status. Okay, so that's who assigns this status. And again, it's based on GDP and life expectancy in general. So, stage one. So, there's 4 stages, and that's what that chart on the very first slide of this presentation with the title kind of showed you. And I'll show you that chart again in a few minutes. So, first of all, stage 1 is pre industrialization. There's a high IMR and a high death rate due to access to clean water, stable food supply, and healthcare. All right, there tends to be a high TFR due to a lack of access of education for women and contraceptives and family planning. Okay. There's a need for child agricultural labor. So we need more people in our family to help work the fields, to help raise money for the family to survive. There's little to no growth due to this high CBR, so a high birth rate, but there's also a high crude death rate, which is they're kind of balancing each other out. So a lot of kids are being born, but a lot of people are dying as well. So this country is what we consider to be in phase one. Essentially, not any country in the world and anymore at this point is in phase one. Okay, so no country do we consider to be at this stage. Now, stage two is what happens when modernization happens. So, this is when you start to get access to clean water. Although I do realize, so I just said that most, like no country is considered to be in stage one at this point. However, I do feel like there's areas in some countries that are probably still look like they're stage one. Okay, because then when we move on to stage two and we talk about having access to clean water and healthcare, that's not true in all places in Africa or Asia. So there's still, so while the UN might say that these countries are not um, in phase one, I still think there are areas that are. But for all intents and purposes and based on data, these countries are not in stage one. Okay. All right. And then stage two not only brings this access to clean water, healthcare, and the stable food supply, because of these factors, the IMR and the CDR both decline. So that's a positive. And then the TFR does remain high because there's still a lack of education for women. There's not as much contraceptive use being made available, or they're not educated about contraceptive use, and there's not a lot of family planning that occurs. And then there is still a high need for child agricultural labor, so that TFR still stays high for that reason. And then there's also just this overall generational lag. It takes time to educate. It takes time for those changes from the education to sort of take place and for that societal change to actually spread throughout the population. Okay, so it just takes time for these things to happen. It's not something that just happens, 1 week. 1 week we're not, the TFR is low, and the next week it's high, or it's high, and then the next week it's low. I mean, and as we're advancing, it doesn't happen like that. And so these countries are still experiencing rapid growth. And due to this high, because they have this high CBR, that high crude birth rate, but actually because of access to food and clean water and some healthcare, the death rate's actually declining. So that's why we see this really advanced growing population, which is what we see in these African countries and parts of Asia as well. And then, what are some of the economic and societal indicators that tell us that a country is in stage two? There's a low per capita GDP, shorter life expectancy, high infant mortality rate, a high total fertility rate, low literacy rate, and school life and school. So, not a lot of children are going to school. A lot of people are reading in these countries, and there's low life expectancy. So, that. And then stage three. Stage three is a modernized economy and society increases family income. So we're seeing that the GDP is actually going to be high in these countries. Total fertility rate declines significantly because more and more women are going to college or pursuing education at all. There's a delayed age of marriage. So women are not getting married when they're 14 and having children. They're now waiting until they finish, a standard education or even potentially higher education. First, they're delaying when they have their first child so that they can focus on their education and their careers. There's access to family planning. There's access to contraceptive use. There's education about it, so it is getting used. And so what we'll see is a slowing growth rate because that CBR is going to drop, that crude birth rate is going to drop, and it's going to drop closer to the crude death rate. So those are going to become a little bit more balanced out. And then we have these socioeconomic indicators that tell us that a country is in stage three. Again, a high GDP, a longer life expectancy, low IMRs. TFR is closer to that 2.1 or that replacement level fertility, and then a high literacy rate and school rate and life expectancy for all members of the society. Okay. Stage four. Stage four is what we consider countries that are post-industrialized or highly developed. These are highly modernized countries that are very affluent. This is the West and Australia. That we kind of lump Australia in when we talk about the West. They are very affluent. Their TFRs have declined even further as families just become more wealthy. More wealthy means they spend even more time on education and careers. Many women in these countries are not having children until well in their 30s. Even 40s sometimes. Increased wealth and education brings even more prevalent use of family planning, contraception. We have families now that are having babies because of in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination and lots of different options. And then CBR drops lower than this death rate and growth becomes negative. Okay, so again, Germany is a country that's experiencing this. They have a very highly educated female population. Their CBR has dropped so low that it's lower than the CDR at this point. And so they have more people dying than are being born. And so their population is declining. Okay. The economic and societal indicators of a country that's in this level 4 would be a very high GDP, the longest life expectancy. The TFR is below replacement value because it's actually declining, and then the highest contraceptive use rates. And could even add on here the highest rates of education. Okay. You'll see in some things for apes that we're actually even moving into a stage 5 now, which is like post industrialization, where countries are starting to have more kids because they are so wealthy and they figured out that whole family planning and how to have work-life balance because there's so much wealth, and now they can have more children and have those kids in daycare and things like that. So we actually are starting to see families that are kind of transitioning into a higher CBR, where that CBR is increasing compared to the CDR. And so you'll see some people will actually talk about, like if you look up the demographic transition model online, you'll actually see where there's a stage 5 that they're starting to put into these graphs, where we're starting to see the growth slowing down. Like we're going back to that, like there's still growth occurring. So it's not declining growth. It's actually starting to grow more. And it's a more advanced society. Okay. So again, this is the chart that you really need to make sure that you know. Here are the stages, the 4. You're only going to be tested on the 4 stages, but this is important to know. And then here's just another time that we've put this population growth rate equation on here. So birth rate minus death rate divided by 10. Again, that's for global population. We don't have to worry about immigration and immigration because no one's going on and off the planet unless they go to Mars, and that's not happening. So at least not yet. So Elon Musk might get us there. I don't know. Anyway, but for this FRQ, you're going to identify the stage of this graph in which population grows the fastest and explain why this is the case. Besides population growth rate, describe one economic or societal indicator of a country in this phase. Okay, so what phase is this? And describe one economic or societal indicator of a country in this phase. And let's see if there's anything else here on this PowerPoint. And no, that brings us to the end of Unit 3. Awesome job, guys. Don't forget, if you have any questions, we're going to be working on the math because we've talked about some math in this unit, but we're going to be working on that. If you have any questions, make sure you're reaching out to me, coming in during Pathways for extra math practice or help. Don't be lost on the math. We're going to have the math all year long. So you want to get the math down now so that you feel confident going into your test for every unit, but also for your test at the end of the year. Okay. All right. That's it for Unit 3, everyone. I'll see you in class. Make sure you reach out to me and see you next time.